Alrighty, folks, we're back for episode 13 of the Popcorn Square podcast. I am your host, Neff, along with
Kage
and
Buttons.
And today we're talking about originals versus remakes. This is going to be a great conversation. We got a few lists of our own that we're going to go through, and we're going to talk about a couple other things that have to do with this topic, but I'll start off. The first movie I have on my list, and I'm going to start off lighthearted, is Mulan, right? So I believe we have the original Mulan came out, and I think it was 1998, right?
Sounds right.
Classic for anybody that grew up in that era, right?
Love me some Mushu.
Right, and some funny things that I looked up and found on this thing, like little facts. That movie cost $90 million to make.
Wow.
You think $90 million in 1998 for an animated film? That's like pretty crazy budget, right? It made like $330 million. But moving on, we know that, I guess you could say the remake of Mulan came out in 2020. That didn't do well at all. I think it was mostly because of the pandemic, right? It came out like probably in the beginning or middle of the pandemic. I think it went straight to Disney Plus too, if I'm not mistaken. And then it kind of went to the theaters after, maybe limited showings. I think that had an effect on it as well. I don't think people gravitated to the story as much.
There was also a lot of pushback from China.
Yep. So you had that controversy there, but I thought this was interesting to list because you go from an animated version of a film to a live action version. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic with that remake. But yeah, of course, I think everybody here has seen the original Mulan. I think everybody here has seen the 2020 version. It's an entertaining movie. It wasn't bad, but when you're comparing it to that original, nothing's really topping that original. Kind of like the Lion King thing, where you have the Lion King, that's the animated version, and live action. The live action wasn't bad, but it just doesn't top that original. Could be nostalgia, could just be quality overall. But I thought that was interesting. Mulan was on there for me. Then I had Omega Man and I Am Legend, right? So Omega Man, similar premise, right? You have Robert Neville. In this version, right, the original, you have vampires. They're kind of like the antagonists, right? And he's trying to heal them throughout different methods, but he can't really find a way to do it, right? Ends up befriending a couple vampires, stuff like that. He ends up dying in the end, kind of like how they do in I Am Legend. But I know in I Am Legend, the main antagonists are like the zombies, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a little different, you know what I mean? I think even the locations are different. I think Robert Neville is actually in like San Francisco in Omega Man, and then Robert Neville in I Am Legend, he's in New York. So a little different scenery, stuff like that. But I think those are two good movies. I think Omega Man came out in 1971, and the budget for that, I either have the budget or the box office. I think the box office was like $4 million, something like that, right? So it didn't do numbers out of the gym or anything like that, but it's still a good movie. I think everybody should go watch it, especially if you're into those 70s movies, stuff like that. And then I Am Legend did pretty good. I remember when that came out. That was a pretty good movie. I think it made like $500 million. I think it took about $100 million to make. There was a lot of effects in it visually, you know what I mean? I think all the zombies were CG. And if nobody has seen I Am Legend, you should go watch it. But there's a funny scene with the mannequin where if you pay attention to the mannequin, right? He sees the mannequin, right? The mannequin's head actually turns, slowly. You don't really notice it when you're watching it in real time, but that's a little creepy aspect. I think it just shows how his mind was frayed with all the events that had happened and led up to that point. But yeah, Omega Man, I Am Legend. If you guys don't know, Omega Man is the original, and that's based off a book, right? And then I Am Legend is the remake to that story. Then the last one I had was Scarface. So most people don't know that Scarface originally was a 1932 noir film, right? And it follows a mobster named Tony Calmonte, and he's in Chicago, right? So it's like kind of based around like the outfit Chicago mob. And he gets into some problems with the Irish mobsters. I guess he's messing around with them, gets into some trouble, gets a hit on his head, basically. So he has to deal with the guy that he's working with, who's another mobster in Chicago as well. Long story short, he ends up dying just based off a shootout with the police, right? That's how he ends up going out. And if anybody knows about the 1983 version with Tony Montana, right, Al Pacino, he's a Cuban refugee that comes over from Cuba, comes to Florida, gets into the drug trade, and becomes one of the biggest drug traffickers, right? So some similarities there, but for the most part, the basis is a little different, right? You got the same character name, but you have a guy that's set in the time period, right? So 1932, a mob was big, noir film, and then with 1983, you got the drug trade with Miami. You know, that was a real thing as well. So kind of relatable on that aspect as well. But funny enough, the budget, dude, for Scarface 1932 was $800,000. 1932. $800,000, and it made $600,000. So it didn't perform well, right? Now with Scarface, when that originally came out, that didn't perform well as well. Kind of like a cult classic now, and probably seen as a classic overall. One of, I'd say, Al Pacino's most distinctive character roles, and one of his most popular, right? Everybody knows who Tony Montana is, right? But that, I believe when that came out, it didn't do well out the gate either. And then over time, it's been able to become a cult classic. People watched it, liked it, and it's got its money. But yeah, two great films there. And I think those are two films that I don't think people really understand have an original and then the remake. The 1983 version is not the original. So I think that's kind of like a history lesson on the side there for those three. But that's what I got. I'll pass it over to Buttons, and then we'll go with Kage, and we'll see what they got on their list. Go ahead.
So for me, I mean, obviously there's a ton of remakes out there as far as, you know, you could just type in Google and say, hey, show me some remakes. There's a ton of them out there. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention all of the live action remakes that Disney is going through right now. It's been a trend for the last decade at least, as far as the movies that they're trying to recapture or and even in some cases kind of do a little bit of reimagining, such as taking our villains from these movies and giving them kind of a twist on their story, and you know, pushing it out as like a, hey, you know, maybe these characters, they had some backstory to them that the rest of the world didn't know about. And so maybe we shouldn't just blindly hate these characters because we don't know what they were going through. You know, some of my favorite ones that they did that with would have been like Maleficent and Cruella. But, you know, I would have to say, as far as just traditional remakes go, probably some of the ones that I thought they did a good job on, and these are movies that I actually saw the originals of as well. True Grit, You've Got Mail, which of course is not one that everyone here has probably put on their list, just because, you know, it hits differently on my end. But and then It, and I remember It as you know, one of those ones that my sister really loves Stephen King. And so, you know, I was watching those with her, and, you know, just to get to see it in theaters, the way that they did it and gave it such a much bigger budget than the original, because the original was made for TV. So it did not get a lot of the love that the theatrical version was given, you know, in terms of, you know, special effects. And of course, obviously, it being about 20 or so years later from when the original came out.
I want to say almost
Maybe
25,
closer
30.
to, maybe closer to 30.
Yeah. I think it was
but
early 90s,
there's-
the TV version
Well,
came
if you
out.
recall, I think last on the horror podcast, I pointed out a little Easter egg for those that don't know. So
Oh, because it was 27 years, right?
'cause the
Okay,
lore,
that's what it
It
was.
shows up every 27 years to feed.
That's
so it's just
right.
like they couldn't have planned that any better. They came out, the miniseries came out 27 years ago, and just so happens to be 27 years later. Let's drop that movie right now, just
Right.
to add.
Right,
to it. That was really
right.
cool.
Right. So definitely those three would be on my list, as far as, you know, giving it a good opportunity to really show what the passage of time can do to a movie in terms of updating, as well as having that larger budget, maybe getting some more famous actors, or seeing on the flip side of that, having just a different generation that they're trying to appeal to, such as You've Got Mail. I mean, the original was set, you know, I think back in the 40s. So it was updated, rebooted, however you want to call it, to, you know, AOL. Like, hey, America Online,
Right,
you've got
right.
mail. And that was kind of a joke too when I was growing up, because for anybody in my generation, AOL is not really a thing anymore. I mean, it's,
Rest in peace.
Yep.
but those are going to be what I have on my list. Kage?
Yeah, so bouncing off of what Button said, there was surprisingly a large number of remakes. I had no idea how many movies that I've watched in my lifetime that were remakes. Some of them were remakes of remakes. So I think try to keep this down. So does anybody remember the 1982 version, The Thing?
Of
John
course,
Carpenter.
we
Yep.
talked about that. Yeah.
So I remember seeing that back then, and it was scary as hell. And I got older and I watched it again, and I looked it up, and apparently it was got horrible reviews back then. I'm like, how? You know? And then I watched the 2011 remake, but then I discovered it's not a remake, it's a prequel. Okay?
Yep.
And so the original one, I almost want to say, is better, because back in the 80s, due to technical constraints at the time, that was all practical. You're looking at a puppet that they made, animatronic, whereas the new one is all CG'd. And I get it. Where you're going to find an alien that shapeshift in real life, how you're going to do that. But again, I argue, in the 80s they did it, they pulled it off. Come on, Hollywood, let's get it together. Another movie I said is we talked about Dune. Dune, me and Neff, big Dune fans. Buttons, I believe you said you saw the Dune remake as well. The 1982 version, I saw it back then, loved it. Dune was put on me as a child, and when I found out there was an 82 movie, went to Blockbuster right away and I saw it. I loved it because it was all we had. And then I got older and I watched it again. I'm like, what is this? What are they doing?
Didn't hold up.
Didn't hold up. No, not at all. And I did research on it, and you was unanimously hated.
Yeah,
And if you know anything about your Dune lore, it's a very dense story, very, very dense. Lots of backstories, politics, prophecy. There's all kinds of things it touches on, and ultimately it suffered from just the weight of its own gravity here. I don't know what the words to say. There's too much content to squeeze into a 2-hour movie. And so there's many books. So the movie that's going to be coming out very soon is based on the first half of the first book. This guy, back in the 80s, they tried to cram, I don't know how many stories, how many books into one thing, and it was just a jumbled mess.
Right.
But then you got the new version, the 2020 version, I want to say. 2021.
Yep.
They took their time. They said, we're only going to do the first half of the book. We're going to give you just enough information. And some Dune fans will argue they probably could have done things better. Of course, any remake adaptation, sure, you can always do better. But they did a smart move by breaking it up into 2 books, making it more digestible. Another film, Aladdin. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Going into Disney.
We're going to go into Disney now. Don't hate me, audience. Don't hate me, okay? I'm about to say some stuff, rustle some feathers. First and foremost, love Robin Williams. I'm pretty sure just about anybody who grew up in the 90s will share that sentiment. You guys can't see it, but Buttons is giving me the smile of approval. Everybody loves Robin Williams, right? So 1992, loved that film. I remember seeing it with my parents, took me to see it, sat in the front row, because that's what you do as a kid, and loved all the songs and everything. And then they came out with the live action version. What an act to follow, right? Following in the footsteps of Robin Williams, I want to say, real life drama aside for Will Smith and the Oscar thing, not going to go into that, but I think he did a good job. He played the genie, and he did his own thing, and I respect that. He wasn't trying to be Robin Williams. He wasn't trying to tap into that. He did his own thing, and so the songs were catchy. I thought the special effects were on point. They even added some new songs, and it hit the same story beats. So I feel like that was pretty good. I was pleasantly surprised. I wasn't walking into it like, oh my God, I'm gonna hate this. But I went into it, like, okay, let's see what he does. I wanna see how they handle it. So I think they did a great job there. another movie, kind of going to the dark side here. So for me, as you guys have known, I'm a big horror buff, and one of my favorite movies of all time is 13 Ghosts.
Yeah.
In 2001. I think that is just a good time.
Mm-hmm.
Just a good time. I love backstories and lore and paranormal horror, and that scratches all of those itches. Like, each of these ghosts has a story.
Right.
Everything. I'm like, let's go.
Mm-hmm.
I found out many years later in life that is actually a remake. So 13 Ghosts, spelled the word 13 in 2001, is a remake of 13 Ghosts in the 1960s. And it was spelled 1-3 Ghosts. Now, what was really cool about that 1960s version, they had effects.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to think, 1960s. They didn't have 3D glasses, but it was the same principle. So they would give you, they weren't quite glasses, but they would give audiences a thing where you watch the film and it shows stuff floating around or whatever, and you can't see it unless you look through the other lens. And it's not something you wear on your face. It's kind of like you hold it up to your face, and it has two lenses, as it were. So you look through one lens and you can see the stuff floating around and the actors reacting, and you go down here to this lens and you can see it. Like, I wish I could show you guys. It's very fascinating, and that was a big deal at the time. I think 3D movies didn't really pick up until the 80s. Am I wrong?
I'm not even sure when 3D movies.
I want to.
I would say pick up maybe 80s, late 80s.
Yeah, like that's when the red and blue.
And I think it
Yeah.
might have become a big deal in like the theme parks too. Like maybe Universal
Yes.
Studios
Yes.
might have implemented that type of tech before it got to like a mainstream theater.
Yeah, it was a lot easier because of the amount of work that goes into creating those 3D effects with the film. So, most of the effects that they started out, I do believe you're right, Neff, that they would have previewed and kind of gotten feedback in the studios and in much smaller short videos and things like that, to kind of gauge interest, as well as provide something extra special for the guests that are watching it in the Universal Studios, or kind of like backstage lots and things like that. That would have been, very specific and just easy to repeat. Like when I was a kid and went to Universal Studios, I remember doing like a Back to the Future ride. And with that, you go in there and, they had at that time green screen already. Of course, this would have been, early 90s. So mid 90s probably. But the because I have like a terribly embarrassing home video of, we were doing like a chase scene, like my mom and my sister and they gave us like little fake prop guns, and we were like, hey, the police are chasing you, fire back at the police. And of course, me being like 6 at the time, I was like, of course, staring directly at the camera and firing like sideways where they tell me to fire. So everybody else, my mom and my sister, they're like into it, they're looking the right way, and me, I'm just kind of like dead eye staring directly at the camera, like, what is this camera doing? Like, I must keep my eyes on the camera. But so that's why I say it's the effects, of course, would have been there at that time, and I do know that Back to the Future ride did use special glasses and different effects like that were the ride lasted, I'm sure it was like maybe 2-3 minutes, as most of those rides are. So they would have definitely previewed a lot of that tech to smaller audiences to begin with, just like they have today in big theme parks as well.
Oh yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
right.
You have to have like test audiences or test. I don't know I don't know what the phrasing is, but yeah, you'd always have to test that.
Well, and they're able to deliver a much higher quality 3D effect or experience, as you will. I remember going years later, probably 2017, I believe, and they had like a ride that was, you're on an actual moving ride, and the 3D effects you didn't need glasses at all for. So the technology was there, and such that the way they projected it on the screens in the tunnels that you're going through with these with this particular ride, where those 3D effects are jumping out at you, and the quality is such that I know there was a lot of talk around 2010 to 12 timeframe where they were going to start putting out TVs, 3D TVs that didn't require glasses. And it was great
Yeah, I
because
remember that.
even the TVs that they did have that were 3D, you had to wear these big, bulky glasses with batteries, so they were heavy and expensive.
Yeah, not very practical.
Yeah, so I mean, I owned some of those, and it was great to watch it, but most of the movies that you would buy that had those 3D effects, they were not, they didn't have enough in them to kind of warrant the cost of it, just because studios looked at it and said, this is not something that all these people are gonna have. So they, put in just enough to keep the audience entertained with like a sudden, ooh, it's jumping out at you, without spending so much money on it. And I had touched on Jurassic Park. They had redone that one, and that one was
Right.
amazing. If anybody owns a 3D TV still and has that and wants to go get that 3D version of Jurassic Park, it's
Yeah.
worth it.
So Kage, finishing up with your point there on 13 Ghosts, I remember we talked offline about how they actually have the glasses in the movie, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's an
So they're
excellent
kind of
point. So
showing some appreciation for that original film.
yeah, absolutely. Because I didn't think about that. The most impressive thing about this nugget of information is that first off, in the 1960s, that's impressive. If you would have said in the 80s, I'm like, okay, I remember when
We're hitting a turning point.
we're hitting a turning point.
Yeah.
That was the turning point.
Right.
That was that was when it really took off. But I had no idea it existed. But it wasn't 3D. It was an optical illusion. And I don't know. I could be wrong. I don't know if there's any other movie that has done that. Not 3D, but shown optical illusions. Something that gets the crowd
Engaged.
engaged in that manner. But going off of what you said about the glasses, right? I didn't know, and I don't know if anyone in the audience knows, other fans of 13 Ghosts, if you knew that was a remake. But that glasses, that's the callback to the 1960s version. So in the 2001 version, they're like, oh, you got to wear the glasses so you can see the ghosts. And you're like, oh, that's cool. You get the gimmick, but you don't realize that's actually a callback to the original thing because the
Right,
characters.
right.
So that was the other thing. In the 1960s version, the audience gets those special glasses or lenses. Like they hold it up to their face. They don't wear it. But also the cast members, the people in the movie, they actually have glasses and they can see the stuff. So you're seeing it right along with them. You're reacting right along with them. So I think that's pretty cool. I would like to see more movies kind of have that interactive, I don't know, fourth wall breaking
Yeah, that'd be
thing. I
interesting.
think that'd be really cool.
Yeah.
And then this is just kind of spitballing. Now, this, I might be alone on this. So I'm in the horror, and everyone knows about The Grudge in 2004. It's actually a American remake of a Japanese movie called Ju-on. Okay? Ju-on, I've watched it quite a few times. Not that great. And here's why. It's very slow. It's funny. Japan knows how to do anime, all kinds of crazy, great stories. But J-horror is kind of hit or miss. That one is very, very slow. And I've seen interviews and articles where Japan saw the American version of Ju-on, The Grudge, and they said our version is scarier because the scares come more frequently. The effects are significantly better. They paint somebody white,
Right.
and that's your ghost.
Right.
Whereas this one, you're like, oh, you don't want to be with, you don't want to even see this thing 100 feet away. You just don't. Kayako. So yeah, those are probably my four. I can go on.
Awesome
and on.
list you out there. Funny, before we actually got on, folks, Buttons brought up a great point about remakes and imaginings. And I'm going into the next topic here where we talk about how the remake of a film can tell the same story in a different way, and I'll let her speak on her movie. But I thought about it as Kage was talking about Scarface. Now, it's a remake, but the story is different. Like I said, you follow Tony Calmonte, who's a mobster in Chicago mob noir, mob times, and that's relevant to that time period. But like I said, in the 1983 version, you have Tony Montana, who's a Cuban refugee, right? Remake, different story. So that's a good, I guess, example of what I think Buttons is getting at. And I could say the same thing for Omega Man and I Am Legend. Tweaks, little differences. You know what I mean? But for the most part, remake, similar story, little differences. Kind of a reimagining. Buttons, you had a good point with a movie you brought up before we actually came on. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this kind of goes, a little bit. I think that they were well done, and I believe they were both very well received. But Disney did what I would call more of like a reimagining, and that's what Neff is referring to, and that's the would have been Maleficent movies and Cruella. So with Cruella, of course, that's a reimagining or a different take. It's actually supposed to be a prequel to 101 Dalmatians. Cruella, of course, being the villain. With Maleficent, that's Sleeping Beauty. And of course, it starts off as well as a prequel to Sleeping Beauty, and then the rest of the movie ties in closer to the traditional story of Sleeping Beauty. But when Maleficent first came out, because that was the first one that Disney did, everybody was like, oh, this is going to be it's a villain story. But wait, this is like, she's not the bad guy. I'm confused. A lot of people went into it not quite sure, because we had already seen, Marvel and, comic books in general introduce these anti-heroes. And Maleficent was presented as this anti-hero. Like in the story of Sleeping Beauty, she's like out to kill Aurora, and you're like, oh my gosh, she's this horrible witch and is a terrible person and has no heart, And with the Maleficent, you get to kind of see how she became that character in the story. And in some ways, they kind of tried to say, well, from somebody else's perspective looking in, sure, she looks like a complete villain, like there is nothing to her that's good. And then you kind of see that twisted side of it where it's like, oh, wait, she was the jilted one here. Like she was the one who was betrayed. And that's why, she's the way she is. But Cruella is kind of the same story. She starts out as just a normal person, and then, stuff happens to her in her, prequel, I guess you could say. And that's what turned her into Cruella that we know and, don't want her to skin puppies alive. But that was an interesting take. And I believe that both of those movies or reimagining of those characters were received really well. I don't know. I didn't look up any of the numbers on any of those movies, but I mean, obviously Maleficent spanned a second movie, so Disney must have made some money in order to give it a sequel. But those were the two movies. Kage, do you have any that you can think of that were kind of along the same lines?
Reimaginings. I won't lie to you. This was a real head scratcher for me. Trying to think, is that was a very good question.
Yeah, it was a good
very,
point.
Very good questions. I see remakes being better than the originals all the time, telling the stories. I see it in the video game industry a lot, especially lately. Trying to think, like, going back to what I said about The Thing, I looked it up. The original one got horrible reviews, very negatively received, and the new one did better. It wasn't like blowing doors down, but it did significantly better. Even though
review-wise, you think?
It did better review-wise, money-wise, like just across the board.
Well, do you think that's because people were familiar with the original version?
Yeah, had to have been.
And because I mean, there wasn't a huge time gap between those two movies.
Oh, there was.
There was.
Well, no, I mean, as far as
the
generation that would have been watching it. I mean, you could
you're
make
saying.
the argument
Yeah.
that the people in the 80s could very easily watch the 2011
Right,
version.
and not be lost or say, what is
Right.
this? Yeah, I mean, I get
Yeah.
what you're saying there, yeah.
Yeah, they definitely.
I mean, versus something from the 19,
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Well, I had to look it up because I won't lie to you, I haven't seen either movies in a very long time. But the 2011 version, again, it is a prequel. I did not
Right.
realize that. because I went on YouTube and I went and looked at the beginning of the thing, and I was like, oh. So I thought that was nice that they sync that up, like showing it's literally right after that scene. And even though it's decades later and new actors, you can get away with it just because how the story works, and it's a shapeshifter, and it's like, we don't need the same actors, but the scene, spot on.
Right. Yeah, good point there, Buttons, and I'm glad we really touched that topic. We'll move on to the next topic, though, and that's discussing the benefits and drawbacks of remaking a film. Now, I think the benefit is you can hit a different audience, maybe a newer generation of people, more money in the ecosystem now, so now you can fund the project more. You can tweak certain things so that it's more adaptable to the new generation of people, right? And then you always have that, I wouldn't call it a drawback. I think it's a benefit for a remake because you can say, hey, you know, if this movie's getting a remake, more than likely people like the first one. So you can kind of fall back and say, we have some inspiration here that we can draw from and then build out and then bring to a new generation of people. So I think that's kind of a benefit for remakes. Another thing, drawbacks, you know, you have to worry about how the audience will take the movie in. Maybe an older audience that remembers the original, they might say, you know what? You guys tried it, but nothing's gonna top the original. Nice try.
Star
and then
Wars.
right, and then we and then we've seen remakes that come out, and people just are not feeling it, as Buttons just touched on. So I think those are a couple things you can see when it comes to benefits and drawbacks. I feel like depending on the quality, you know, of the first film that came out, the original film, the reception of it, I think that really determines how the remake pans out. You know what I mean? Kage just said himself, 1982's Thing came out. I love The Thing. It's one of my favorite sci-fi horror films, right? Maybe the reviews weren't that great. Maybe it was kind of a slow burn, like I said, with the original Scarface, right? But it's become one of those classics overall. And so when 2011 came out, it's like, okay, the effects, the CG, the story's not as strong. You know what I mean? People are kind of attached to that 1982 version, so they might be seeing it completely different if they're in a different generation. Now, someone that's a little younger might say, hey, I didn't know about the 1982 version. I'll go do my research and watch it, but this 2011 version is letting me know the premise and the story of where we're at now. So I think those are the benefits and the drawbacks. I'll start with Kage here and what he thinks benefits and drawbacks could be of remakes.
Yeah, I agree with you, Neff. The benefit is, yeah, you're bringing in a story, an existing story, to a new generation, exposing them to something new. Because, you know, Hollywood's all over the place when it comes to storytelling, and there's still a lot of great stories back then that could use a revival. So I think that's great to share those stories with new audiences. But it's also a double-edged sword, you know, kind of going into the drawbacks, you know. You got those people, if you got a really solid film back in the day, a really solid story, and you really like that, some people are very passionate about that. Star Wars being a great example. That was a huge hit.
The prime example.
Huge prime example. The example. People loved that, and you don't mess with nostalgia, man. People will come after you with a vengeance. You will not remake this movie. That actor sucks. This scene is like, what are you thinking? Like, there's endless amounts of hate online. You don't have to look far, ladies and gentlemen. So, I mean, yeah, you want to be very careful. That's a drawback for directors, you know, when they're remaking a movie. You better tread lightly. You better touch every story beat. You better pick the right cast. You better not change too much.
And the thing about Star Wars, too, not to cut anybody off, it's not technically a remake. It's like sequels, kind of like how Kage said about prequels. But the fact of the matter is, even when you're bringing in characters, legacy characters that were in the older versions of the movies and then bringing them into the newer versions, it can have that same effect as making a bad remake, even if the movie's not a remake. So I think Star Wars kind of gets hit with that, where it's not a remake, it's a sequel, but, you know, they take the older characters, they kind of dish them off as side characters now. They try to prop these new characters up. You know what I mean? A lot of the characters aren't even who they were in those original films. So, not original, but the prior films, I should say. And so I think people look at that and they say, you know what are you guys doing here? If you're going to use these characters, you need to treat them the way they were treated in, for instance, episode 4, 5, 6, right? And so when you're doing 7, 8, and 9, Luke being who he is in episode 8 makes no sense. A lot of people have said Luke Skywalker would never act like that. He would never do those things. So I think that's that line you're treading. But good points there, Kage. Buttons, benefits, and drawbacks.
I will briefly touch on what you're talking about with Star Wars, because I would make the argument, and don't hate me, everybody, I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, but I will say this in terms of Star Wars, and there's just really no other way to get around saying that, yes, it technically is a sequel, but for the most part, if anybody's talking about Star Wars that's a fan, they're going to refer to it as the original trilogy versus, the newest trilogy.
Right.
And so, yeah, technically it's not a remake, but come on now. You got the three same cast, 2 guys and 1 girl,
Similar arcs.
and a robot, and
Right,
they
right.
go off on their adventures to fight against I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's
the
basically
Empire,
copy
then,
and paste,
it's-
different characters, different names.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Same
So,
story.
but it really is very close to the same story. With the one exception, which of course, Star Wars always had its twist in there. But with Kylo Ren and Rey. I'm sorry, that was just completely out of left field. So if you're going to say there was a twist in that movie, other than what they tried to
Palpatine
make,
coming back.
well, right, with Palpatine, well, the granddaughter, right? Oh, she's the granddaughter. Oh my God, I'm sorry, that was not that epic to me. I feel like that was kind of a cop out. They could have given her such a better backstory than that.
Yep.
But with Kylo Ren and Rey, I was just kind of like, you guys could have built a better backstory for their supposed romance. But going back to what I was going to say about, things that are the benefits and the drawbacks of these remakes, I will say that one of the benefits and some of the better remakes are because you have that previous generation sometimes, or even just super fans who end up becoming directors or producers or writers, and they enjoy that content so much that they're like, man, this was my childhood, this was the best thing ever, and I want to do my own version, my own take, and then you end up with a really great remake because sometimes it's writers, sometimes it's directors, sometimes it's actors, but when you get those super fans in those roles, and these were the influences of their childhood, and they're now bringing it to a new audience because they're like, hey, I want you to have the same joy and the same, excitement over going to see these characters on the big screen, and, they put their whole heart and soul into it, and it shows. Sometimes that's a detriment, sometimes that's a good thing. But I would say more often than not, it's to the benefit of the audience that you get these super fans, trying to recreate something for your audience.
Right.
Drawbacks, we've pretty much touched on all of the major drawbacks. The only other thing I would say is when you get something that's truly awful in terms of a remake or even an adaptation, it can turn off an entire audience. And that's what's sad, is because, if something had gone horribly wrong with one of these remakes, just terrible writing or acting or whatever, and you're like a super fan and you go and you're like, man, I'm so jazzed, I'm so excited, and you're going to have younger audiences that may have never seen the originals that you're going in to watch it for. And they sit down and they're like, I hated it, So now they're never going to get to experience the original because they're going to be like, I saw that. That was terrible. I don't want anything more to do with that. And so that's kind of another drawback that you could say.
Interesting. In the last topic we're going to talk about, going into that, you went right into it, how a studio can keep a fan base happy. I think there's a couple things they can do. Not interject politics into the movie in the remake, right? I think they need to get a solid team of people that care about the original and the lore of the original. All right. I think direction has a lot to do with it. And I think it could be that the studio has a lot to do with it as well. What studio is funding this thing? Are they known for having executives that get too involved in the production of a film? Do they make good picks when it comes to actors that they're going to have act in movies, directors that they choose, anybody working with that film? So I think those are a couple things that studios can do to keep the fan base happy. Also, too, I think they just need to be mindful of the original audience that liked the movie and then try to kind of target that audience. If you go to make a remake and you don't target the demographic, it's probably not going to perform that well. You know what I mean? So that's a couple things I thought that a studio could do to keep a fan base happy as far as making a remake out of an original. Kage, you have anything on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, keeping a fan base happy when it comes to remakes, stick to the source material. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. You know, you want to show that story to a new audience today, but you also want to scratch that nostalgia itch for those that saw the originals. You definitely don't want to step on any toes there. But if you don't change things too much, I think that'll make audiences happy. I feel like if good actors,
Yeah, good
obviously, because you can have a great story, but if you have a B-list actor, that could make or break the whole experience. And like Buttons said, let's say you're a big fan of the original movie and you bring your kids, or you know what I mean, you're like, oh, this was a favorite of mine when I was a kid, you're gonna love this. How soul-crushing it is when your kid is like, that sucked.
Right.
You know what I mean? And you're like, no, I swear it was good. It's good. And it's up to you as a parent to go, we're going to go home right now. We're going to watch the original Ninja Turtles, not this Michael Bay thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? And that's what I would do if I was a parent. I'd be like, listen, we're not going to watch this. I'm going to show you the original and see what you think. And if you watch the original and you say it's crap, okay, whatever.
Right.
I'll let that go, but
Ninja Turtles just ain't your thing.
just ain't your thing.
And it's funny you brought that up because, like, we talk about Dune all the time, but Dune's a perfect example of an original that people didn't really care for in the second film. I think a lot of people are not familiar with the story so much. There's a fan base that is, but it's not as popular, right, as Star Wars. But the Dune story came out before Star Wars, so it's ahead of its time. And I think when the original Dune came out, I don't believe we necessarily had the infrastructure or the I guess I want to say the resources to actually create the film that it should have been. And in that version that you saw, and I believe it's 2021, they had all those things. So you can have some people that aren't A-list, but, right, you have the money now to fund it. You have the right director. You have the right team that is, engaged in the lore. And so that's why you get an original that people might not even care for or say it's terrible, and then you have the remake and it knocks the doors off. So that's like the example of the opposite, right?
And something to go off of that, too. I've watched, talking about Dune, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to see us talk about Dune a lot in the future as well.
At least the next couple months.
Yeah, for real. So just kind of buckle up and be prepared for that. But I've watched interviews with Denis Villeneuve, the director of Dune. And I'm going to say, guys, for all you Dune fans out there, it's in good hands. This isn't a man who picked up the story and thought this was a good idea. This is a man who actually read the books, plural. There are multiple books. He is actually a fan. And so that shows in his work. When you're going to make an adaptation, a remake, and you got someone who's truly passionate, not someone who's in it for the money, and I think that'll make me a lot of money. He's actually somebody who cares about the story, and he wants to do the best service that he absolutely can. And so he was very good at picking out his cast and picking the setting. This wasn't shot in some studio with a green screen. He literally had all of these actors in the Jordanian desert filming this. Yep. So he went all out. So that's passion. I think that is something that makes a fan base happy. You can tell when the director cares.
Buttons, you have anything as far as that last topic there? How a studio can keep a fan base happy?
I mean, for me, I've definitely seen my fair share of, bad remakes, and I think you hit on a lot of them, we have discussed in the past, remakes that are gender swaps.
Yep.
And I feel like, we talked about Ghostbusters, for example. They've done it with Ocean's 11. They did it with one of my favorite movies from I believe it was in the 80s, might have been early 90s, but that was Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. They did the exact same thing, did a gender swap on it. And, I think there's a place for gender swapping. If you're doing an adaptation of something, I don't think it's necessarily going to be quite so terrible if you do it with certain characters. I don't think it should be your main characters. And that's just me personally, if you're trying to keep the fan base happy. You know what I mean? Because if people are watching these movies thinking that, oh man, they're going to do an adaptation of this book that I read and I love it, or this movie that I used to watch and I really enjoyed it, and you go and you sit down and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm confused. Like, where's Egon? Where you know what I mean? Like, where are the characters that I know? You gender swapped them and you're kind of like, okay, maybe they'll do a good job, but at the same time, it just hits differently regardless. And like I said, in some cases, it's not going to be a bad thing. And in many cases, people don't mind it at all. But your hardcore fans, they are going to mind. They just are, because they're like, you're not even trying. You're
hijacking it.
Yeah, you're making it something that it's not. And if you are saying this is a reimagining of it, sure, okay. You just need to be upfront about it. You need to say, hey, this is not the same thing. Like, take the story in a different direction. Don't try and copy and paste the original movie. Be like, hey, this is its own thing. I think an all-female cast Ghostbusters could have worked if they hadn't tried to make it the original. If they had just been like, hey, there's this other group out here, they did it, why can't we do it too? We're going to start up our own Ghostbuster agency or whatever and go out and fight ghosts. I mean, I feel like that would have been far better received than being a reboot just with female characters.
Makes sense.
I wonder how successful Ghostbusters would have been if they would have said, it's affiliated with Ghostbusters, but like, we're in another location and we also do ghost busting. Like, if they said, we're doing our own thing, maybe it would be more well received. Right. Instead of just blatantly saying, no, we're it, because you're pissing off an entire generation, essentially.
Right.
I mean, even if, like I said, I guess with what's out there in terms of mainstream movies today with the superheroes, you've got a lot of the alternate dimensions, alternate realities. You got your Spider-Verse, your multiverse, all of the verses. And that's fine. And that kind of gives you that allowance to go ahead and do your gender swaps and things like that, because you're like, okay, it's built in to the story. But this is in these cases, this is not built into the story. So I mean, give it a different name. A perfect example of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels that was essentially Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, but with women, was a movie that they did called Heartbreakers. And it was a perfect example of how it's the same story essentially as Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, but with a female cast. And I loved that movie, and I didn't have anything wrong to say about that movie. By the way, if you guys like that kind of Dirty Rotten Scoundrel kind of movie and you haven't seen Heartbreakers, go see it. Find it somewhere. It's an older movie. It was made in like early 2000s, I believe. Jennifer Love Hewitt, Sigourney Weaver, I believe, and Gene Hackman, and it's great. But I just felt like they'd already done it. They redid it, reimagined in a different way, and it would hit so much better than the same story replicated with a female cast.
Nice, good points. I think we're going to end it there, guys. We had some good points, good discussion there on the originals versus remakes. I'm your host, Neff.
I'm Kage.
Buttons.
You know, guys, like, subscribe, comment, join us for the next episode. We appreciate you guys participating. We appreciate you guys listening. Thank you for being with
Thank you.
us, and be safe.